Welcome to Lilac Dance.
A podcast by two disabled artists about creative expression and processing emotions.
My name is Elena Chambers. I am a writer and a musician.
And my name is Heather Benet. I am a dance teacher, choreographer, and mixed media artist. So how have you been lately, Elena?
I've been all right. How about you?
I've been okay. You know, I was sick about 3 weeks ago, which was just like the winter cold that isn't COVID, but still is rough. And then, you know, you go to the doctor, they're like, well, you're not contagious anymore, but...
But you still have symptoms,
but you still have symptoms.
Yeah.
So,
totally.
You know, it's still February in Michigan.
It is. It isn't snowing or anything today. It was for a while. I faced my fear of the freeway earlier.
Oh,
so,
yay.
You know, I was glad there was no snow for that experience.
Yeah, you want like dry weather for that.
Make it as easy as possible.
For sure. Oh my goodness. Wow. And how is social work school going?
It's going all right. You know, there's some bumps in the road. Which I think maybe is to be expected in a grad program.
Right.
But I'm learning a lot. I'm learning, you know, things that I wasn't necessarily expecting to learn, but still are valuable learning experiences, you know, like advocating for yourself and, you know, taking responsibility and stuff like that too. So it's actually been really good.
I'm glad to hear that.
Yeah.
Of course, with any academic program, there's going to be bumps in the road.
Yes, and I am really thankful that I have like such a great like circle of friends, and you know, professors this semester have been really responsive to just being able to willing to talk through things and being open to, you know, if problem solving and stuff like that. So I think, you know, all in all, it's been good.
Wow, I'm so glad to hear that. That's awesome. And, you know, talking about academics relates a little bit to what we're going to be talking about today.
It is, yes. It's a very good point. We're going to be talking today a little bit about the concept of giftedness, especially as it relates to education. And this was kind of inspired a little bit by an Instagram post I made that I expected to be maybe a little controversial, but it actually was very well received. So I thought that I might get some backlash from the former gifted kids of the world or the current gifted kids of the world, or you know. And so if that's the boat that you're in and you're watching this, just know, you know, that's totally valid to have had that experience. But I just think that in that narrative, since it is very common within the neurodivergent community, I think there's some stuff to unpack within that. And within, you know, how are we conceptualizing giftedness? What is that reinforcing when we identify ourselves as being gifted kids or something like that? So that's kind of my perspective as someone who is most definitely not a gifted kid. Like I was the like, what is she doing and why can't she do basic math kid? So yeah, I guess that's a little bit what we're gonna talk about.
That's awesome. So I'd love to start with just what is this social concept of a gifted kid? Let's start with that so the audience can kind of understand, like, what is that? Maybe where does it come from? And then where do we start to disagree with it?
Right. So I think that one thing that a lot of people talk about is just the sort of connection in their experience between being perceived and labeled as gifted when they were younger and being in advanced classes and stuff like that, and then finding out as an adult that they're neurodivergent. And I think that it's really interesting that people have kind of noticed a pattern with that. And I think there's definitely something in there that is, you know, worth looking at and worth considering and stuff like that. So you know, it's not necessarily a problem that people have pointed that out, but I think the thing that it's important to remember is that there are times when this one experience has been extrapolated to apply to the entire neurodivergent community, when the reality is a lot of us were not perceived as gifted as a result of being neurodivergent directly. So when we equate neurodivergence with giftedness, it leaves out a lot of people and a lot of the community. Especially, it sort of forgets people with learning disabilities whose particular kind of brand of neurodivergence exists inherently outside of the standard constructed notions of giftedness, quote unquote, because those were kind of defined in opposition in a lot of ways to learning disability experiences. And, you know, that's not necessarily true like 100 in every single way, because I think a lot of people with learning disabilities maybe would come off as being like quote unquote gifted in certain ways as well. So it's not necessarily like a blanket statement. But I think that the thing about learning disabilities is that the way that they're identified, or, you know, something is identified, it might not be a learning disability, it might be you're not trying enough, quote unquote, or something like that. But the way that something is identified is that someone notices a lot of the time that someone is not meeting some kind of expectation. And I think that's where the idea of giftedness kind of comes in, is like a lot of the people who are defined sort of in opposition to this giftedness concept, or in sort of a oppositional relation to the giftedness concept, are the people with learning disabilities, are people who are part of the neurodivergent community who might be left out of this specific conversation a little bit more. So I think it's important, you know, when we're talking about giftedness, we have to realize that it implies the existence of another group of people who's also listening to this, you know, whole kind of giftedness thing. Conversation. Yeah.
Wow. And it's really interesting to think about, like, I think I was probably known as one of the gifted kids because I was able to get A's and I was able to, with my neurodivergence, still do well. But I never thought about the flip side. Except I actually did think about the flip side in certain situations now that I think about it. Because when I was 11 and I was in a car accident and I developed post-concussion syndrome, and this was before we knew I had ADHD, but I had a lot of symptoms of ADHD at that time anyway. But post-concussion syndrome can look like unable to concentrate, fatigue easily, a lot of similarities to neurodivergence. I was then in like the special education class for parts of my day at school because the regular classroom was moving basically too fast for me. And I remember being like, feeling like, whoa, like these kids are barely in our regular class, like if at all, like it's like separate. Why is it separate? Not understanding, noticing the way that regular education and special education are handled differently. And so it's very interesting to hear this sort of other side of the conversation. Let's say I was like the gifted kid, and you wrote in your Instagram post that you're a former ungifted kid.
Yes, and that was, you know, the point of that was, you know, to describe a certain experience, but also to make people a little bit uncomfortable of having to kind of think about the other side of this. Because I think that a lot of the time when people talk about these experiences of being gifted, of being perceived as smart, they're not thinking that anyone who had the opposite experience is listening, or they're not thinking that, you know, that I think they just aren't totally considering what the opposite of that would be. Even. Yeah.
For sure. And it is detrimental to a lot of people. Like, could you speak a little bit to like what your specific learning disability is and like what that looked like, what you heard from teachers?
Yeah, for sure. So I have a learning disability called dyscalculia. It was not diagnosed till I was 18. So I went for a lot of my life without really knowing what was going on there. I definitely was very aware there were things that I had a whole lot of trouble with that other people didn't, and other people were also very aware of that. But it took a while for people to realize, like, it's a learning disability. Although I will say, when I was like starting from the time that I was like in high school, I started thinking that I did have a learning disability. But it was interesting because the only learning disability I'd ever heard of was dyslexia. I had never heard of any kind of math disability or anything like that. So I was thinking, well, like maybe I have that. But then I also was aware that I didn't have any of the kind of difficulties with like letters or reading or, you know, something like that that would be present in someone with dyslexia. So I was thinking maybe I have some kind of like really unusual, like it was just sort of, I had never heard of dyscalculia before. And neither had a lot of the people around me. So I think when I was 18, it was thanks to my mom who finally thought to Google. I don't know why I never thought to Google this, but she thought to Google, is there a math learning disability? And I guess this popped right up. So amazing that happened. I'm grateful for that. And so then I was tested when I was 18, when I was a senior in high school, and I did have a learning disability. And that was the process of going through that evaluation was very interesting because they wrote a lot of stuff on my chart that was, you know, maybe an unusual choice.
Like what? I'm just curious. If it's not
they
too
wrote
traumatic.
that my intellectual ability was severely impaired.
Oh my god.
And like, there's nothing wrong with like having an intellectual disability, obviously, but it's this stigmatizing language of like severely impaired, like, you
Just
know,
the word impaired is so
like, yeah, like what does that mean?
stigmatizing.
Like, anyway, so, you know, it also was just, you know, kind of frustrating to go through all these like tests where they're intentionally giving you things that like you're bad at, because I mean, that's kind of how they have to determine like what you have trouble with, but it's all this like, put together these shapes in this specific pattern, and I'm like, but you know, I came up with some really interesting patterns of shapes that were absolutely not what they were going for, but I was like, I think mine might be better, you know.
Yeah, right.
Just kidding,
right.
but...
No, I love it. I love the attitude.
Yeah, so I think, you know, I was not perceived as gifted for a lot of, you know, growing up and stuff like that, because I think that maybe people, especially like teachers, maybe thought that I was good at certain things, which, you know, I was, but I also think that what really kept me from being perceived as like gifted across the board was like the difficulty with math, the difficulty with random other stuff that no one really understood, like reading a clock, riding a bike, finding my way around, understanding directions.
And all of that's related to dyscalculia.
And all of that is related to dyscalculia. Okay. Yeah. And some of it might be related to some other undiagnosed stuff. I don't really know, but yeah. So a lot of it is related to dyscalculia. So yeah, I think for that reason, that's really what kept me from being perceived as actual like gifted kid, quote unquote, by a lot of my peers and teachers. Because I think that the emphasis was more on the things that I very obviously had trouble with. But then it was interesting because when I finally got to college, after I did 3 years of music school, during which I was very much also not perceived as gifted, because learning the instrument's also very difficult with dyscalculia for a lot of different reasons. I think I finally had the experience of like being perceived as smart, actually, and you know, being someone who is seen that way. And it was really, really wonderful because suddenly it was like the standards shifted from being, from defining intelligence in relation to things like math and tests to, you know, how well do you contribute to a conversation? Can you speak eloquently? Which, you know, that
maybe also is like its own form of
that's its own problem.
Issue, but
100%. Like, can you speak in a way that they value in academia?
Yeah, which is wild.
Can you write things? Can you, you know, stuff like that? And all of a sudden it was like, oh, this must be what it's like to feel like you're gifted or something, like, you know. And I still had trouble with certain things, but then I think what would happen was, as soon as something would come up where it was related to what I struggle with due to my learning disability, there was a lot more confusion and a lot less patience than I was expecting from some of these professors who seemed to be really enthusiastic and encouraging when I was performing intelligence in the way they expected. Then it was like, what's happening? Why are you having trouble with this? And I'm like thinking, I told you I had a learning disability, but it seemed like maybe they didn't think they would actually have to encounter that learning disability.
Wow.
So it's kind of interesting.
So I feel like from what I'm hearing you share so far, from what you've kind of put on Instagram, it's like, there's like, anytime you emphasize a certain group, it's like an underemphasis on another group. If in many ways that can happen. And I feel like there's other ways in our society, like with beauty standards, that this sort of comes up, where it's like, if you say a certain thing is one definition of beautiful, then what about the other people that don't fit that definition? And so that's kind of just what I thought of as you were talking.
That's a great point, and I think in both of those examples it's really great. It really works because, and I wrote a blog post a really long time ago about the similarities between standards of intelligence and standards of beauty.
Really?
So go check that out. Shameless plug. But I think the other thing that's really similar about those two things is that in both cases there is kind of a dominant group that is where one group is viewed as, you know, having the characteristics that are deemed ideal, and the other group is viewed as having less valued characteristics to a degree where sometimes there's even like this false moralization or moral value attributed to certain kinds of traits when it comes to both intelligence and beauty. So it's like the exclusion of one group and the exclusion of other group don't necessarily have the same impact, even though it might have an impact in both cases.
Yeah, wow, that's really well said. And using that language of like the dominant social group, because that is the group that benefits from the privileges they have, and then there's always going to be a group that's not benefiting.
Right, exactly.
Always. Wow. Well, I think that was really well said. Is there any other points you'd like to make on this topic?
Yeah, and then I think after this we can move on to whatever else we want to talk about.
Sure.
But the last point I think is just that a lot of people have sort of tried to counter this narrative of like the giftedness narrative in the neurodivergent community with sort of a new kind of narrative of the twice exceptional person, meaning that you are both, like, to put it in the way that I think it's intended, like both exceptionally like less than average in one area and exceptionally higher than average in another area.
Whoa.
So what I always think of is like, oh, well, I'm exceptionally good at this, but I'm also exceptionally bad at this other thing. So I think that narrative is also a little strange. This is going to be an unpopular opinion. Some people really like this like solution to this problem, but I see the intention for sure. I think it's also a little bit problematic though, because it still defines what exceptional is. And it's still defined in relation to a perceived norm and a perceived positive exception and a perceived negative exception. And I think we just need to get rid of the singular definition of intelligence. We just need to we need to be done with it. We need to start recognizing a lot of different types of intelligence and understand that one is not better than another. There's not this like twice exceptional, because it creates this sort of false binary, I think, when it comes to intelligence too. So that was the last sort of point I had about that one.
Thank you for sharing that. And that did trigger just more thoughts about my own journey, like where I was seen as, honestly, like even though I got all A's, I don't remember being told I was gifted, but I know that if they had to group us, they would have just like thrown me in with like gifted, in quotes, gifted kids. But I'm thinking about like my artistic talents over the years. So like I never was praised in art class in school, like ever.
Oh,
and then I stopped taking art in middle school when it became an option to stop.
Oh no, and you're so good at art too. Like I'm thinking about like your art is so beautiful.
Thank
you should have gotten recognition for it.
Thank you. Well, it's just wild how then with the journey, I was always a dancer, so I always felt artistic in that sense. But in terms of like studio art, I never had confidence from it because I wasn't, maybe one time the teacher was like, oh, that's good. But I never was like encouraged to like do it. And maybe I also didn't see too many examples of people doing art directly around me. But that's not even true because I can think of several friends I had that excelled at that. But I just think it goes to show like when you put intelligence in like a binary of like you're good at this, you're not good at this, like it just doesn't help people. And then there's stories like my own where it's like, you know, I start painting in my 20s and I love it. And it's like, but what happened to 10-year-old Heather's paintings?
100%. That's such a great point because it was something that you really loved to do, but because that wasn't reinforced by people telling you, you felt like you shouldn't do it anymore, which is really sad. And plus, you know, your art is so beautiful. Like, we should show it on the podcast sometime.
Here, I'll go get it right now.
Oh, nice. Perfect. I like that one. That's one of my favorites that you...
Okay.
Yeah.
This is for image description for folks who are not looking at the video or are visually impaired. This is a sort of a Zentangle painting with bright red, orange, yellow, pastel green, deep green, muted pink, white, mixed blue purple, light blue, and lastly black colors, paints. And I have made sections of paint. I've made like kind of like a soft triangle and then like a kind of like a banner and then just sectioned it out and then filled in the colors And then I added a lot of like circles and polka dots and some lines. So it's a very fun, bright painting. And I made this in recovery from surgery, which we can actually touch on today.
Yeah, we definitely want to give an update.
But yeah, just to think about like how you could give up on something because of the way that society is praising intelligence could harm you or benefit you in one area and harm you in another. And I think that's really important to think about. And I think it's important for everyone to reflect on their stories. And is there something that you gave up when you were young? Or is there a place that you were gifted, but gifted in quotes, but somebody else, what happened to the others in that situation? So yeah, I think you touched on a lot. And I think we've given people a lot to reflect on.
For sure. Yeah. And thanks for showing your art.
Yeah, of course. So I feel like it'd be good to now touch on kind of like my recovery process.
Yeah.
I had a call with Mayo Clinic yesterday or 2 days ago or something.
How did that go?
It was okay. So they were asking me like where I'm at compared to before surgery, and I was brutally honest. I was like, some days I think maybe I'm 5% better. Most days I'm 0% better. And they're like, okay, do you regret the surgery? And I'm like, you just jumped to conclusions.
Wow.
Like, holy crap, like that was... But I think they're trying to, because there are regret rates of percentage of people maybe that regret, and I'd imagine it's low, but they're probably trying to just gauge for like percentages wise, which is weird.
Even so, though, it's like you're telling them you're still in pain, and they're like, "Oh, but let's collect some data." Like,
yeah, it's so true. It's like, wait, what? But I get that they want to touch on that emotionally too. They want to understand like where you at emotionally. And I was like, first of all, you told me that it can take a year to recover, and it has been a little bit over 2 months. I was like, I'm patient. I'm hanging out over here. I do have faith in my body to make a full recovery. I just think my body is one of those bodies that takes time. And so many of our bodies take time to heal from injuries, especially if you have multiple disabilities that interact. You know, I have the ADHD, the depression disability, and the physical disability, and they all interact because ADHD is like, I want to be active, but I can't be active because I'm in pain. That's the physical disability. And then the depression kicks in, and it's like, you're just going to heal really fucking slowly. But they recommended some physical therapy, but they said to take it with a grain of salt because not all PTs are amazing. They were honest about it. They were like, we're telling you PT is optional because you basically might want to find a PT, learn a regimen, and then get out of there. They kind of said that. They were like, they know they have the best PTs at Mayo Clinic, maybe, but they can't send me to Minnesota for physical therapy.
Have you had a physical therapist in the past who you've liked?
I did have one that I liked, and he didn't force me because I told him I had trauma surrounding being told, like, do this, it'll make you better. And then I'm like lifting a 5-pound weight, and I'm like, it's not helping me.
Yeah.
And it was like very traumatic over the years because this all started when I was 11. And he actually resigned from his position as a physical therapist and director of his physical therapy clinic like a week before my surgery.
Oh, that's right.
He wants to start a private practice, but the reality is, even if he gets his private practice up and running within a year, he might not take my insurance. So it's like, I can't wait a year. I have to go find someone, and that's really hard.
That's definitely one of the big like downsides of private practice in any kind of profession is the whole insurance like situation, for sure.
So now, you know, I'm probably going to find a PT place either close to my partner's house or close to my house, and just fingers crossed that I can find someone that knows about Bertolotti syndrome, because that's a syndrome I have. But I just don't want to, there's a PT recommended to me on the other side of town. The amount of time I can do seated, including driving, is limited. So if I have to drive 30 minutes to get the best PT in town, is it worth it? It's a really hard decision to make.
Because then that's already 30 minutes of being seated. Yeah.
So that's kind of the update. I have to get another round of x-rays because Trinity Health didn't take enough x-rays. Like, they had the script from Mayo and then they took 2 out of 4 views, and it's just like, come on, people, I have to go back and get another x-ray.
Oh,
and
man.
I'm hopefully gonna do that tomorrow, but it's just frustrating, you know.
Yeah, and I'm sure that's, you know, it probably takes a lot out of you to have to keep going back and getting all this different stuff done. Like, I know it's, for me at least, it's very stressful, like going to the doctor, and so imagine like doing that over and over and over again. It's a lot.
It is a lot. It weighs on me, and it's part of the reason why, you know, I, other than like my literal physical health disability,
Right.
all the complications of healthcare is part of the reason why, like, I don't work full time, because how would I manage taking care of myself
Right.
in addition to, oh, you have to get x-rays again, oh, you have to go to Minnesota again, oh, you have to
Right.
it's
Oh,
just,
yeah.
it's a lot. It really is. So, you know, I'm trying to do things I enjoy and rest and relax, and so, you know, have been making some more music. I have a song I wanna show you.
Oh, I'm excited.
Yeah, so overall, disappointing that I'm not doing amazing.
Mm-hmm.
I'm an optimist, and that serves me at this time, so I'm just grateful for being an optimist.
That is awesome.
Thank
Like,
you.
I have so much admiration, like, for your optimism in this situation, and how, you know, much you've just kept such a positive outlook on things. I think that is so amazing and really, really impressive. Like, a really great skill. So, yeah.
I appreciate it. Awesome. Well, thanks everyone.